Good evening, everybody. Welcome. I'm Jennifer LaRue. I'm the Director of Public Programs here at the Mark Twain House and Museum in Hartford, Connecticut. And I'm so grateful to have you here this evening for what I know is going to be a fascinating conversation. How do I know? Because I just spent a few moments with our guests in the green room, Adam Wilson and Chris Beha. And it's going to be really fascinating to talk about this wonderful book, Sensation Machines. Before we get to that, though, I have a little bit of housekeeping to do. First of all, I want to make sure that you all discover the chat area, which is on the right-hand side of your screen. There are a couple of messages there already that I'll talk about in a moment. But please do chat away and make friends. Let us know where you're tuning in from. That's always fun. But we are going to have a Q&A session at the end of the program. And if you have any questions for either of our speakers tonight, rather than put them in the chat, if you could do me a favor and stick those in the Ask a Question area at the bottom of your screen, that would be super helpful. It's a lot easier for me to keep track of them there. And also, you can upvote somebody else's question. If you go in and see that somebody else has asked the question that you wanted to ask, you can click on that, and that moves it to the top of the pile. So please do take advantage of that. While we're looking at that part of the screen, I'd like to just direct your attention to that long green bar right under my face that says, "Your support is vital to the Mark Twain House and Museum." Your support is vital to the Mark Twain House and Museum. I'm really happy to say that after a very long year plus of not being able to offer our main source of revenue, our guided house tour, we are back in business offering that tour 7 days a week, and people are piling in and taking advantage of that. But it's been a long time coming, and we've been without that revenue stream for much of the past year, and have been depending on the generosity of people like yourselves to dig into their pockets and see what they can share with us to help make things happen, like these free virtual programs that we have been offering 2 and 3 times a week for much of the past 15 months or so. So again, any little bit or lot bit that you can share, I just want you to know that it's put to very, very good use, deeply appreciated by staff and by the Board of Trustees of the Mark Twain House and Museum. So thank you in advance for anything you can do to help us out along those lines. Speaking of helping us out, tonight you have an opportunity to order a signed copy of Adam Wilson's book, Sensation Machines. Now, we know you can buy that elsewhere, sure thing, but if you choose to purchase through us, first of all, you get a signed copy, which is not something that you get everywhere. And also know that your purchase does support the Mark Twain House and Museum, and we deeply appreciate every single purchase that you make. So consider that, if you will. And while we're talking about that kind of thing, I just want to also say that the Harper's magazine, which we've been collaborating with on this incredibly fascinating series of author talks for the past few months, has created a special offer for people tuning into these programs. It's a special subscription fee, $16.97, gets you a full year subscription to Harper's. And I took advantage of it, and I love getting my Harper's in the mailbox every month. And that also gets you access to the full archives, which, a lot of people have archives. You would not believe the Harper's archives. And our own Mark Twain did write for Harper's magazine a few times. So if you dig around in the archives, you can find some of his writings too. So consider taking advantage of that very, very generous offer while you're with us tonight. So I'm going to introduce our guests after I point out that tonight's program, like so many of our programs, is produced in part with support honoring the legacy of Frank Lord. So tonight we're joined by Christopher Beha, who is the editor of Harper's Magazine. He's been the host of many of these programs with us, and he's a good friend of the museum. And he's the author of the recent novel, The Index of Self-Destructive Acts, which he talked about here with us. I think it was just last month. And then Adam Wilson is a new friend of the museum's. He's the author of the novel Flat Screen, which was a National Jewish Book Award finalist. His stories have appeared in the Paris Review, Tin House, and the Best American Short Stories, among many other publications. In 2012, he received the Terry Southern Prize, which recognizes wit, panache, and sprezzatura, which I'm not sure what that means. We're going to have to ask him, in work published by the Paris Review. He teaches creative writing at New York University and lives in Brooklyn. And I'm delighted to have them both here with us this evening. I'm going to bring them up on screen. Hello, Adam. Welcome.
Thank you. Thank you for that introduction.
Oh, thank you. And hi, Chris. Welcome back.
Hi.
So, Chris, you're going to call me back up when it's time for Q&A?
I sure will. Yeah,
All
thank
right.
you, Jenna, for that introduction. Thank you to the Mark Twain House again for hosting these events. We've been having a lot of fun with them.
We sure have. And we're going to have fun again tonight. See you in a little bit.
Okay. As Jennifer said, I'm Christopher Beha, the editor of Harper's Magazine, and it's a great pleasure to be here with my buddy Adam Wilson to discuss this book, Sensation Machines. I think it's been about a year and a half since I first read the book in Galley, and I loved it so much that I sent Adam a blurb for it, although he had not solicited a blurb from me, I don't think, and perhaps didn't want it, but he got it. And I'm just going to, by way of brief introduction, just read that, since it is sort of my best effort at capturing what I love so much about the book. I said, Sensation Machines is part techno-political thriller, part social satire, and part family drama, and it succeeds wonderfully on all fronts. The book is smart, funny, and fast-paced, with lots to say about the mess we're in, but the thing that has stayed with me is its heart. Adam Wilson exemplifies that old Pinchonian dictum, keep cool, but care. And I'm not going to say that much more because we're going to spend the next hour talking about it. I'm just going to invite Adam to read a bit from the book.
Great. Thank you, Chris. It's very kind. And thanks again for the blurbs. So I'm just going to read very briefly from quite early in the novel, a couple pages in which the first section, or really the first chapter's narrator, protagonist, is a guy called Michael Mixner, and he's a Wall Street banker, a derivatives trader who's lost all of his, he and his wife's savings recently, and he has yet to tell his wife. And he is currently, it's sort of the sun is rising, and he's walking across the Brooklyn Bridge into Manhattan, trying to sort of figure out what he's going to do. I should mention that I'm not from around here. I was raised off an exit ramp in East Coast Exurbia, where every gas station sells Red Sox crapaphernalia, and the strip malls aren't yet full franchise. They're still half occupied by local bars and burger joints, blue lit, filled with car-hearted brosifs and their female companions, Tara, Brittany, Aurora, etc., sassed in green eyeshadow, in beer light shadow, in Bud Light soft stupor, whittling away their middle 20s with wet eyes and dry skin, wet bars and dry heaves, and Japanese trucks that somehow still run after all those miles spewing dust and American fumes. Of course, that's a romantic half-truth, because one, I'm from the Berkshires, 20 minutes from the quaint town of Lenox, which is home to both Tanglewood and a community of retired Bostonians who antique on Saturdays, then head to Williamstown Sundays for a taste of the theater. Their cottages are dotted with Rockwellian Americana purchased from the nearby Rockwell Museum, scented by potpourri and sawdust, cinders in fireplace, local kale simmering on stovetop, steeping itself in red wine reduction as grandma dusts off the viola, prepped to serenade grandkids with riffage from the Charles Ives songbook. And two, my family was different, not your typical townies, what with gamer dad, immigrant mom, face-tattooed sister, and my Long Island cousins calling me toward femininity with their fluoriated perfumes and ethnic rainbow of American Girl dolls. Not that we were special. In most ways, I resembled my classmates who lived in colonial-style homes that spiraled out from the abandoned factory. And though the local recession stayed in remission through the early aughts, the current crisis had brought unemployment back to where it was when GE pulled out in '91, leaving 10,000 jobless, including my dad. Terms like highbrow and lowbrow had ceased to have meaning in a place where, no matter one's taste, you were stalled in what was outmodedly called the working class. Pittsfield was a microcosm for what I'd come to think of as the great American unibrow, an unruly line that connected east and west across the painted plains, dotted with the same mediocre takes on what had once been regional cuisines. You could get a Southwest-style quesadilla from Seattle to the southern tip of Florida and find no difference in the Chipotle rub or soggy jack cheese. So I left for New York, forgoing Audubon trails for the feeling I get on the Brooklyn Bridge at dawn, the feeling I got as I walked and scratched and called across that dirty river for someone to save me.
Very nice. Thank you for that. So I want to start by talking about what I'll call broadly the world of the novel. The part that you just read, I think, gives a good sense of the voice of the book, at least the parts that are told from Michael's perspective, and then the general sort of social tone of social observation and satire, and the level of kind of precise social detail it has and cultural detail. But you from that passage, you would probably think that it takes place in just precisely the world that we live in now, but that's not quite true. So can you talk a little bit? Some reviewers described it as near future. I'm not actually even sure that that's the case, or if it's just our contemporary time slightly askew, but it may be that it's.
Yeah, I think of it as sort of a very, very near future. And I guess, a future that sort of got nearer as I was writing the book in certain ways. It's funny. So originally, I was actually trying to write a novel set around the 2008 Wall Street crash, and I spent that the sort of earliest drafts of this novel. I mean, not even a complete draft, but that was sort of the original idea. And I was doing a ton of research around those events and sort of trying to figure out how to, create a fictional narrative around it that would be interesting. And the two things I sort of came to, one was that there's a very, very complicated event and a sort of difficult thing to try and integrate into a sort of fictional. There was so much. There was so much that I would sort of have to stick to, I guess, and also it was an event that I realized, was sort of quite interesting to read as a nonfiction. Like, I read a lot of nonfiction books about it, but I'm not sure what exactly I could add as a novelist necessarily. And I also think there was a lot about it that I didn't really understand, or that seemed sort of beyond my grasp of economics. And so I had this idea to sort of set it around a different Wall Street crash that I invented myself. In large part because that felt really freeing. Like I could sort of, change the events to suit the needs of the narrative rather than the other way around, and to suit the needs of the story. And so I had this idea that it was sort of just like a near future that could be tomorrow, I guess, in which, and there are a few other things that are maybe a little different, but in which there's been another huge crash, and in which maybe we've progressed a little in terms of stuff like automation, which I've been reading a lot about, and sort of how this was going to cause these huge, these huge problems in terms of employment and stuff. And so to sort of look ahead to that a little bit. And so that was going really well, and it felt very freeing to be able to make stuff up. And then what happened was, I was sort of quite far along, a number of years into the novel, and then Trump got elected. And I had to completely sort of reimagine what like a viable future even was going to look like, or what, I don't know, in part sort of like the world I'd imagined wasn't bleak enough or something. And so then the book sort of became I mean, at least in my mind, sort of, it's like, well, what's going to happen after Trump when we go back to, you know, the sort of previous status quo? And will we go back to the previous status quo? And how will that happen? And that sort of animated a lot of the thinking about the sort of later drafts of the novel and what I was writing toward.
So I should jump in here and just say, when you sent me the novel, we were discussing some of these issues because you and I sort of went through parallel paths with our novels. We both spent many years working on what we were thinking of as sort of like big canvas, capture the moment kind of novels. And mine, I also decided to set it just after the 2008 crash, and then I kind of stuck to that, and that's where the book is set. But we finished them around the same. I think we were both like about halfway through our books when Trump was elected. We then finished them around the same time, and we I don't know how much to get into this, but we both tried to like get the world interested in a sort of like you know, brainy straight white guy tells you you know, what's going on in society at a moment where that really wasn't what what the audience was clamoring for. And then we both published these books in the middle of last year, right into the pandemic. And I wonder sort of what the last few years, let's say, has made you think about the undertaking, which clearly is one of the things you're trying to do, and I try and do, of like using a novel to try and explain in grand terms what's going on in a society or a culture at a particular moment. Obviously, right now, the much more fashionable thing, although maybe it's starting to wear out its fashion, is autofiction, is this idea of a singular viewpoint, a life that is very similar to the author's life is being rendered on the page, and you don't make any claims for knowing about anything other than yourself and your own experience, and you're just going to put that down as honestly as possible. And we were both trying to write rather different novels from that.
Yeah, it's interesting. I mean, I think, and maybe this is somewhat the case with you too, but, you know, I feel like in some ways the impetus to write a novel like this almost came out of a reaction to try to do something different from my first novel, which was, you know, a novel all in first person narrated by a character who, well, quite different from me in certain ways, it's certainly not autofiction, has a kind of life experience and worldview that were pretty similar to mine. And I think is a sort of purposely claustrophobic book, I guess. You know, it's narrated by a guy who's living in his mother's basement and sort of everything he knows. I had this idea to write a book about someone who sort of everything he knows comes from television and movies, but that's actually kind of a lot in certain ways. But he also, you know, doesn't understand human relationships and things like that. And so I don't know. I think part of, for me, it came out of feeling like that book felt so narrow, and I wanted to try, yeah, and this feeling of wanting to try to sort of tell a larger story, and I think also, I don't know, maybe it's in part the case that I thought I was trying to tell a larger story with that book too, but I felt like you know, the way the book was structured or written, I didn't quite have the tools to do it in the way that I wanted, and to sort of explore some of these kind of larger social ideas, I guess. And you know, I think probably in a similar vein, I mean, so many of the novels that I loved and that I've been reading, you know, were books that did that, and that I felt like, and still feel like I want to be in conversation with. You know, even if not in conversation with sort of the books that are kind of in the zeitgeist at the moment, but or maybe they are too, but certainly, you know, still thinking about, I don't know, this kind of tradition of this kind of novel, and
so I have some sense, obviously, of the kind of writers you're talking about, but why don't you just you know, name a few of the of the books you're thinking of? When you say that tradition.
I mean, you know, DeLillo was a big one that I guess I was thinking a lot about. Bolaño was a writer who made a huge impression on me, and certainly, like, I think originally, you know, when I was thinking about sort of having this kind of polyphonic novel with different voices and looking into different characters, that was a big one. Norman Rush, I think, in a slightly different way, was a writer. Like, Mating was a book that just made a huge impression on me, and sort of like opened the door in a way, I don't know, to think that you can, like, include ideas, certain kinds of ideas in fiction, and how to, you know, I don't know that I succeeded in quite the same way as him, but that you can sort of try to, you know, have these ask these big questions and sort of explore, you know, quite sophisticated, like, intellectual topics within the framework of a novel. And I think also, in a weird way, that was a really important book for me in trying to craft the voice of the, you know, so the first part of this novel alternates between this guy Michael and his wife Wendy, and sort of thinking about how to write a female character in the first person, and that was like the model for me of, like, the great success of at least I think, of a male writer doing that.
And the other thing that your book has in common with all three of those writers is that there's some real plot to it. You know, in Bolaño and well, in early DeLillo, and also in Rush, there are things like murders, which is the inciting event in this book.
Yeah, and I think, you know, I don't know. I mean, I sometimes do find, you know, I like quite a lot of the autofiction stuff that's come out in a lot of positions. Some of it I think is really great, but I also quite like, you know, I sometimes find it very self-serious in a way that, like, I like, you know, I enjoy novels that are fun and that have fun. You know, that's a part of sort of what I'm interested in as a writer too, I guess. And I also think, I mean, you know, it's that tradition, and also, you know, in some ways it's a satire. And I think, like, satire also allows for a certain kind of, I don't know, like, over the topness or sort of, like, zaniness even that other certain, you know, forms don't. I mean, like, another writer that's like been really important to me is Paul Beatty, and I feel like his novels are sort of like totally absurd, you know, totally sort of, like, wacky and absurd, but they kind of, because they're so funny, and the like sentence level stuff that's happening is, like, so alive, and like they just, like, run on this voice that almost, like, allows them to sort of have these crazy plots and stuff like that. So I don't know. But yeah, I also felt like if I was gonna, you know, write a long novel with lots of characters, it needed to have a plot.
Right.
Like you need to sort of keep people engaged. That's on some level. And so some
and
other.
And presumably you also need something to, like, keep yourself engaged as the writer.
Yeah, totally.
Moving yourself through this world that you've created. And
totally. I will say that, you know, in some ways it was a challenge to myself, and I think by far the hardest part for me of the writing of this novel was figuring out how to write a murder mystery. Because I don't think that's something that I'm sort of intuitively good at as a writer. You know, and yeah, it was tricky.
Right. Yeah. Do you? I mean, as we mentioned, so the sort of literary writers you're talking about do this kind of stuff, and you know, the idea of the plot, in the sense of the book, but also in the grand conspiracy theorist, paranoid sense of the plot is obviously really central to a lot of DeLillo, particularly.
Sure. What's that line like?
DeLillo.
All plots move deathward, isn't that?
Yes, yeah, and he and this idea, going back to Mao too, of the role that the novelist used to play in society, the terrorist now
right.
plays, and so anyway, that's just to say that the thing the use of something like a murder mystery plot is in those writers. But I wonder also if you read some just sort of like straight genre murder mysteries while you're working on this, to just sort of like think through the mechanics of it.
That's a good question. I'm not sure that I did. I think I would say I watched a lot of movies, probably.
Yeah. Yeah.
It's more my I don't think I read any sort of like straight genre stuff in quite that way. I read more in terms of thinking about the near future stuff. I read some more like straight kind of, I read like Philip K. Dick and William Gibson and stuff like that, which is sort of genre-y, I guess.
Yeah, Gibson definitely has books that are kind of like mysteries at the same time, that they're kind of like near future sci-fi books.
And like even like a book like The Bleeding Edge, I don't know, which is sort of like I feel like in a way like the most conventional Pynchon novel.
Yes, for sure.
But like in a way that I really liked, like
highly enjoyable.
The pleasures of a mystery novel in a way that he's often seems to be denying you in his own. It's interesting about the, thinking about DeLillo. I mean, I thought a lot about DeLillo and the paranoia and stuff like that. And I felt like in some ways, I don't know, I was reading something recently about sort of the death or the return of the systems novel. And I was trying to figure out, like, I don't know, I sort of wonder, like, I wasn't sure if this even is a systems novel. And in some ways, I think it has aspects of it. And I think one thing I was thinking about is that, in DeLillo, it's always a conspiracy, right? And in this novel, one thing I was sort of like playing with or exploring, I guess, is that, it sort of sets up the idea that you think it's going to be a conspiracy and then it's not. And I think one of like the big, I guess, questions I had in this novel is it feels really like I wanted to say something about this idea of like the role of the individual in large scale, in global events and in sort of the big events of like a culture or a moment. And, particularly with regards to the financial stuff. So the guy is a derivatives trader and, sort of, I became really interested in this idea of like the role of like one guy in this large sort of system that's completely falling apart, and like what is the role of, what is one's individual responsibility, within that sort of machine, and what is and what's one's sort of individual complicity, I guess. And so, like the way the murder mystery works is like in the book, and maybe this is a spoiler, but like, it's sort of set up to seem like it's going to be this big conspiracy. And then really it ends up all these sort of big things that happen are very much have to do with like these small personal motivations and vendettas and things like that. So I guess that was something I was really interested in. And I think, maybe in conversation, like with some of those books, but also like in argument a little bit, or at least just looking at it, those things from a different perspective and thinking about it that way.
So just to shift gears slightly, I want to talk a little bit about the role of pop culture in your work. You already mentioned flat screen and this idea of a character who gets kind of everything that he knows by way of the screen, basically. And you wrote a wonderful essay for Harper's about the golden age of TV. There's a lot of pop culture in this book, and even though it's set in a kind of near future, it's essentially contemporary pop culture. There's a lot of hip hop in it, particularly Eminem. and I'm just interested in hearing. Besides, the level of engagement on this, I have to say, it is not. It does not read like someone who made a sort of objective authorial decision that it would make sense for this character to have a grand thesis about M&M and be sort of obsessive about M&M, and then went and did the research. It feels like it came out of something personal. So
Sure, yeah.
perhaps I'm wrong on that, but maybe you can say a little bit about your own relationship to popular culture as a literary novelist, and then how you like to treat it in your work.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's true, and certainly, when with M&M, it was. I think one of the original ideas for the novel was just like, I want to write a book about a Wall Street banker whose real dream is to write a nonfiction book about M&M, about why M&M is the most important artist of his generation. Then I had to sort of figure out what else went around it, but that was like one of the first things, and why that is, I don't know. I think at one point I had a thought that maybe I would write a nonfiction book about M&M. Or like one of those, that 33 1/3 series. Mm-hmm. And I really had thought maybe I'd try and pitch one. And then I found out that you basically don't get paid to write those books. I thought maybe I'll try to just put it in a novel. But
and then not get paid for that.
Yeah, exactly. But I think part of it is just the age I am. Like I graduated high school in 2000, and that was, I think, like his first album came out when I was a junior in high school, and the second one came out when I was a senior. And I remember hearing it for the first time and just thinking, like, this is the most utterly debased and fucked up thing I've ever encountered. And I'm totally repelled to it. And I'm gonna keep playing it over and over and over again. And I don't know, we don't really choose our obsessions, I guess, but he's just someone I sort of couldn't let go of for whatever. I think in part because it seemed so sort of ethically or morally fraught to like him, and yet I also couldn't deny that I was really drawn to him in some way. And so, that just became a thing I wanted to explore in the novel. And I don't know. I guess there's also another tradition of fiction that I remember when I was in graduate school, there was a really, the sort of conventional wisdom was you don't include pop culture in your work. And, that's
it dates it, or
dates it. That was the thing everyone said, or at least I remember saying, or you don't want to include brand names and things like that. And, to me, I don't know, that seemed really strange to me, in part because I feel when I think about sort of what I can contribute, I don't know, as a writer to sort of the larger body of literature, and I think I'm not gonna I'm not gonna write a Virginia Woolf novel, or DeLillo already wrote his novels, and Faulkner and Joyce, whatever. What can I sort of do that maybe people before me can't, haven't done or can't do? And to me, that really feels it's well, I can write about what it's like to be in the world right now, and what and the world right now happens to be a world that's sort of inundated with brands and with these sort of pop cultural figures and all that stuff. But also, I think it's just something that I write criticism, and I'm interested in writing cultural criticism, and I quite like fiction that sort of mixes that and explores that, and that's able to sort of integrate those criticism of some kind, and I think it's able to explore it, I guess, in a different way than just writing straight criticism is, right? Because you're not sort of exploring it analytically in quite the same way. You're exploring it, I don't know, emotionally or something, and maybe analytically too, in some ways. But it's a somewhat, I guess pretty obscure book, but I for a while I was really obsessed with. Do you know this guy Camden Joy?
No.
So he was a music critic like in the 90s, and like he wrote for like Rolling Stone and stuff, but he also sort of did these strange projects where he like postered the Lower East Side with like 1,000-word essay about pavement that he wrote, and he would like draw it on huge poster board and handwrite it and just like poster. I don't know. He was a wild guy, but he wrote this novel called The Last Rockstar Book, or Liz Phair Rant. And it's the whole novel is like, it's about a guy. And I think maybe this is sort of where I stole some of the idea from, but it's about a guy who has been assigned to write a biography of Liz Phair, and he's never heard her music. And so he sort of like just imagines who she is. But then he starts listening to the music, and then he becomes convinced that she's actually this ex-girlfriend of his who's changed her name, and that all the songs are about him, and he sort of starts stalking her. It's kind of amazing book.
Pale Fire-esque, like he's got
it's definitely it's Pale Fire is the precursor to The Last Rockstar Book, but in the end, it's like kind of an amazing book. It actually is a book about Liz Phair, and you sort of like, you get something about exile in Guyville, that like I've never seen a critic really capture, because it's too weird or something,
Yeah. So I want to mention, because I do think it's one of the drivers of a lot of the richness of the book. We've been talking a little bit about Michael, and you read a bit of, so we get a sense of his voice, and he's the one who wants to write this book about Eminem. But then his wife Wendy is also a sort of frustrated writer, and she works for one of these sort of like marketing, branding, consulting firms that essentially generate content for brands, and that's sort of what she does with her literary impulse. And I, as it happens, my wife worked at a company very much like that before she left to write her first novel, and that world is very interesting to me. But the idea that the sort of creative impulse, the literary impulse, also to a large extent the kind of journalistic impulse, is being taken over by the kind of the world of branding. And you'd said before about like living in the world now is being surrounded by brands, but it's also it's being surrounded by brands that are being consciously constructed as creative acts by other people in order to try and convince you of things, particularly and to convince you to buy their product. But so anyway, I just think it's a really interesting dynamic in the book and what you wind up doing with it. Where did that come from for you?
Well, so I also worked pretty briefly in a kind of I guess I don't know what you call it, like a content studio or something. But yeah, I had been the editor of an online newspaper called the Faster Times. And this was, when I was writing my first novel after I finished grad school, and we got bought by essentially became funded by a marketing company, or like a digital strategy company. And sort of the way we fund the journalism was literally being funded by sort of like farming out our writers to write content for brands and do this kind of thing, including me. Like, so I work there and was sort of part of this fight, like, oh, can you find a writer, who can write, who can do our, I don't know, like write a blog for Ralph Lauren or whatever, like things like that, and pitching these kind of editorial projects to consumer brands, and being like, well, we have all these journalists who can And so I worked there for really full time for like a year, and it was just a very absurd. The whole thing seemed very absurd to me, and funny, and sort of sad and terrifying, and just kind of fascinating in many different ways. And inevitably, I mean, you know, I've only like had a few jobs in my life, so they all have to sort of end up in a novel at some point, I guess. Am I still here, Chris? I think you're frozen.
Chris, I think you are frozen, so maybe you could leave and come back into our crowdcast, and I'll continue the conversation for a moment while we regroup. But Adam, you're still loud and clear. And, you know, this is also fascinating to me for so many reasons. And I'll ask Chris when he comes back on. Chris, I'm going to take you right off. And so I'll pose the same question to Chris when he comes back on, but both of you are working writers with young children. Can you talk a little bit about your writing routine and how you squeeze it in and what your day looks like when you're writing, particularly when you're working on a novel, but also when you're not?
Sure. Well, I used to have a routine before the pandemic, and now everything has just been completely, you know, I don't know. I think the main thing, and it sort of depends what else I guess I'm doing. At the time I teach, and so that takes up certain amounts of my time, and sometimes I'm doing freelance, you know, criticism or other kinds of writing. But I guess the main thing is it's just sort of forced me to be more disciplined in the time that I do have. You know, I now think about like when I was in my 20s and could like spend 8 hours writing, and like most of that time would be like looking at the internet or snacking, or whatever. Right. And now it's like I have 2 hours, and so, you know, I have to kind of just laser in. But I tend to try and do it in the morning. Like I'm definitely a morning writer. Yeah, I don't know if you know the program Freedom that blocks the internet from your computer, but I think it's kind of saved me from, or it's allowed me to get some writing done.
No, I don't know that, but I'm going to look into it. So it just like blocks off any.
Yeah, so it doesn't allow you to like check your email or social media.
Wow.
You can set it, so like I have it set so you can look at the thesaurus and Wikipedia and a couple other things, but no.
And I assume you set that so it doesn't interfere with your teaching responsibilities and so forth. You just use it at certain times.
Yeah, certain times when I'm sort of the designated writing.
Definitely looking into that. And so that, you know, you talked about your experience just now with that brief job working in that company that was, you know, kind of working on branding and stuff. Do you think that overall was a positive experience for you in terms of your writing career? Hi, Chris.
Hi.
Welcome back.
There's a thunderstorm here that knocked my internet out.
You know, I saw a lightning flash behind you as you were speaking a few moments ago, and I wondered if that's what happened. So welcome back. So I just was standing in and asking a couple questions of Adam, and just asking if that job he just described was overall a good experience in terms of his writing career or not. And then I'm going to come back to you, Chris, with the previous question I had asked Adam.
Okay.
Yeah, I mean, I think it was good in terms of just like material, you know. And I don't know. I mean, as a person like me who sort of, you know, I had a couple jobs after college, and then I did an MFA, and then I started writing. You know, I worked in the bookstore for a little bit, and then I started writing novels and teaching creative writing. It's, you know, it's good to have anything that sort of gives me some knowledge about a corner of the world that I, you know, or particularly the working world,
right?
That I can have some sort of authority to write. So.
Right. So, Chris, I was asking Adam about his writing routine, particularly as the father of a young child, and I wanted to ask you the same thing. How do you make it work? How do you get anything done in terms of writing? And with your wife being a writer as well, that must be tricky.
No, it doesn't work.
Okay.
Yeah, that's good. I mean, I don't know. I got the honest answer. I got most of my most recent novel done before even my first child was born, and it was published before my second child was born. And I haven't written a lot of fiction in the last 6 months. So I don't have. I prefer to be honest about that, because it's just like people. If you try and make it sound like you've got something figured out you haven't got figured out, then other people get unreasonable expectations for themselves. If there are, Adam mentioned that some of his former students are here, and if you are one of those people who are at a moment in your life, professionally or personally or whatever, where it's like really hard to find time to write, and then you hear people who are published writers just being like, writers make time to write, then that kind of, you start beating yourself up. But the answer is like, it's not always possible. I would love to live in a world where I was just spent half my time at Yaddo or whatever, and was like putting out a novel a year, but that's just not the world we're in. So I'm sure I will get it figured out again at some point, but I don't really feel like I have it figured out right now.
I can't tell you how much I appreciate your candor. That was really great. Thank you. Adam, I think I cut you off. You were about to say something.
Oh, no, I was just agreeing with what Chris said.
No.
It's tough. Can I ask you, Adam, whether because it's been a little while since this came out, what you're working on fiction-wise?
Yeah, so I had been working on a novel, and I have like 2/3 of a draft of it done, but I've decided maybe I need to take a little break from it, maybe forever. I don't know. Yeah, something about it. I think I need a little space from it. Yeah, now I'm trying to just like write a short story, maybe, that I've written about a page of, and that seems interesting to me for the moment. So we'll see. I'll probably go back to the novel and tear it apart and put it back together. But.
I mean,
well, that Mark Twain shoved Huckleberry Finn in a cubbyhole for a really long time before he came back and finished it. So I would say a break might be a good idea, but do come back. I'm sorry, Chris.
With this book, too, I think there were moments where it just felt impossible. And I had to sort of say, like, it's never, And then, like, you take a little break and you're like, oh, no, I can do it.
Yeah.
Yeah, but I do think like that's this book, and I'm afraid we didn't give a great sense of this, but it's a lot of fun. I mean, you mentioned that's one of the things that you want to be doing, and it does seem like there must have been a lot of moments while you're working on the book where it was fun to be writing this book.
Totally. And I think I never would have finished it otherwise. I mean, I think part of the reason for me that I want the book to be fun is, as I think you said, it's like I need to sort of entertain myself while I'm writing it and to stay with it. And there was a lot of stuff in the book. Yeah, like I wanted it to make me laugh and to, sort of amuse me. If I'm going to spend, I don't know, 8-9 years with something, like it has to... it can't just like depress me every time I look at it.
I imagine that would show in your prose if you were depressed every time you said
I don't know. It's funny. I just interviewed Atticus Lish, who I read his new. Both his books are pretty bleak, but the new one's really, really bleak. I'm like, that's a different type of personality to be like, I don't know, like. I'm going to spend many years just like thinking about the worst moment of my life, essentially, which I think he sort of did with this book. I don't think I have that, kind of, I think I have that in me. I think I need that lightness to you know.
But that's I haven't read the book, but people I've spoken to think it's a beautiful novel. Yeah.
Yeah, totally. But it's more I just like can't imagine sort of like living in that dark. It's just like pitch black. Whereas I think, I don't know, at least with my own writing, there's some darkness, but like I feel like I have to sort of be able to balance that out in order to, just keep going back to it day after day and sort of like living in those characters' brains and worlds.
Well, Harry in our audience from Los Angeles, and I don't know, do you know Harry, Adam?
I do, yes. I do know
okay.
him.
So Harry had a question that kind of ties in, well, it definitely ties in with something we talked about earlier about should writers fear work seeming dated because of pop cultural reference or engagement. But he says, does it feel easier to reference an artist like Eminem now as opposed to when he first broke on the scene because he's more of a fixture of the culture? So can you talk about that a little bit?
Yeah,
thanks, Harry, for that good question.
I mean, in some ways, I feel like maybe it's harder because there are already sort of like fixed ideas in the culture about who he is or what he means or what he represents. I think the danger is you can sort of fall into this trap of, and I think this is like the trap of using pop culture in your work or referencing it, is like using it as shorthand, to sort of do something that the reader can then kind of fill in the blanks. And that was something I was very conscious of. It's like, if I'm going to talk about a song, like I want to write about it as if no one, or, for a reader who has never heard it, and like make sure that it would be interesting, whether you've heard that thing or not, or seen the thing or not. Because I think otherwise, it can, I don't know, I guess otherwise it's like, why even sort of introduce it unless you're going to try and like say something new about it or so in some ways I think that maybe it's harder, but I don't know.
Do you think that we've gotten obviously into a world where the cultural life cycle of stuff has sped up so much?
Sure.
And certain novels try to stay with that, so you have things like those Ali Smith Four Seasons novels where it's writing about a character in the lead up to Brexit, and it gets published like 2 months after Brexit because she's essentially just writing it in real time and getting it out in the world. But most novels are not like that. Obviously, most novels, and you and I both spent many years on these most recent novels. And I wonder if when you're concerned about, one of the things you want to do is write a novel that says something about the culture at large. And when the culture has sped up in this way, and the novel is like fundamentally like a pretty slow form, what you do about that challenge?
Yeah, I don't know. I guess just embrace it in some way,
But is that part of, it feels like a lot of novels have either gone the historical route, even if it's like near history, like mine, or the futuristic, like near future. Right. Was that one of the things that when you were setting it in a kind of like near future that isn't designated exactly what year we're in, that you didn't have to worry about events overtaking it or about it having passed its shelf life before you even finished it?
I mean, I think so. And although it created sort of other anxieties about in some ways events overtaking it, but yeah, that was sort of the impetus behind that in part. And also to sort of like project ahead a little bit in a kind of fun way. I mean, I think also, in the tradition of like some of those, writers like William Gibson or something, it's set in the near future, but really as a way to sort of like hyperbolize trends that already exist and to sort of like, blow them up, or be like, look what's going to happen, look what's going to happen if sort of like things just moving at this speed to the point where this is the kind of inevitable thing that we're going to reach. And I don't know. I always think of this, like these early William Gibson stories where he basically like wrote all these like near future stories on the premise that like the Soviet Union was going to win the Cold War. And so like there are all these stories about how like, you know, this Soviet superpower and like the poor US, the you know, and so he like got it totally wrong, but that's also kind of amazing, I think. And like a sort of wonderful thing that exists now, like this alternate, you know.
Yeah. And to an extent, someone who's writing satire, I mean, it's grand to think that your intervention can somehow is going to change the culture at large. But you know, you're as you say, by hyperbolizing what's going on now and sort of you know, tracing it out a few years from now, you're trying to serve as a kind of warning. And in that sense,
absolutely.
It's not meant to be predictive, or it's only meant to be predictive your hope is that this isn't where the culture arrives.
Absolutely, yeah. I think warning is the exact way that I thought about it.
Wow. So we were talking about, you know, things moving quickly and things coming in and out of popular culture quickly, but I just read an article this week about the fact that we no longer have that shared experience as a culture enjoying the same TV shows. That is impossible anymore. It will never happen again because the market is so fragmented and the venues are so fragmented. Does that also change the way we think about somebody like M&M? I mean, will the market for that kind of phenomenon be so fragmented too that we don't have that shared cultural touch point to refer to?
Yeah, well, it's interesting. Like, yeah, I wonder if sort of those people will exist for sort of younger and younger generations. But I do think I'm really fascinated. I think even because of that fragmentation, with like the occasional figures who do seem to be sort of universally known or recognized, and these kind of people who seem to have, I don't know, like someone like Michael Jackson or something, and or even like Britney Spears,
Britney,
who seem to like be above, who seem to have like reached a place of celebrity that's like beyond that kind of demographic fragmentation, to the point where they don't even seem to be people, but just like, you know, and like brands in this sense, and sort of ubiquitous. But yeah, I am interested in sort of how that, if those people will even exist, that as things sort of move in the direction that they're moving in. Is there ever going to be a pop star like Michael Jackson again, that sort of like everyone in the world instantly recognizes, like, either from the voice or the image or something? I don't know if there will.
Well, let's come back together in a few years and talk about it and see what we've learned. Oh, so
I also don't know if it's a bad thing if there won't.
Yeah,
but
one of the things about being a novelist and having your touchstones be like the kind of writers who you were talking about, these are not. We think within our world there isn't like a bigger name than Don DeLillo. But then you go talk with other people who are not like unliterary, people who read, 5 novels a week, and they're reading the stuff that's on the bestseller list. And you mentioned Don DeLillo to them, and they've never heard of him. And I do think that that it's an interesting. I don't know. There are certain novelists who feel kind of an anxiety about not being at the center of the culture, but then Norman Mailer was feeling anxiety about how novelists weren't at the center of the culture anymore, the way they were in like Hemingway's time. Yeah, we think back on Mailer as being the center of the culture, and then if you go back to the 1920s, then they were worrying about not being at the center of the culture compared to like the rising like cinema stars and radio and whatever, and it just seems like that's always been part of it.
I find it refreshing to hang out with poets who have never been at the center of the culture and have no expectation that they ever will be.
Yeah, you don't go into poetry if that's part of your goal.
Right. And then, of course, our own Mark Twain was very much at the center of the culture and remains so in so many ways. So that's another thing to be, thought about and picked apart. Why him? And how did he do that?
He was funny.
He was
Yeah,
funny.
that helps a lot.
Right?
That helps a lot. And you wore great suits.
He did wear great, well, no, only toward the end of his life. But
Yeah.
they were pretty terrific. Yeah. And he was very aware.
It worked for Tom Wolfe.
Right?
The white suits. That may be what you and I need, Adam.
Yeah, I know. Tom Wolfe's one of the few writers who I think got to become a Simpsons.
Yes.
That's like I feel like then you've made. That's when.
Yeah.
Or maybe for
Pynchon
people
got
our
that.
age, I don't know. Probably now.
Yeah. Pynchon got that.
Yeah, that's
with
right.
With the bag over his
At
head.
the back.
Yeah.
Oh, right. I forgot. Okay, well, your assignment, guys, is to get white suits, and we'll come back
And
in
get
a
ourselves
little
on the
while.
Simpsons.
Okay, so
Yeah.
see what you can do.
Okay.
Well, it is lightning and thundering here too, and I think I'm a little concerned that I might not be able to host too much longer. So it is a little after 8. Share some final words with us, you guys, and tell us
I will
what's
happily
next.
share final words, which is people who have not bought and read Sensation Machines should do so. It's a really, really excellent novel, and I hope that this conversation has whet everyone's appetite for it.
Okay, well, thank you, Chris. Thank you both so much for having me and for chatting with me. This was really fun.
It's delightful to have met you, Adam, and to have you back again, Chris. And let's do it again soon. And yes, I'm going to read this book over the weekend. I just got it, so I haven't read it yet, but I can't wait to now, especially. So thank you both, and thank you to our audience for being here with us. And everybody have a great holiday weekend, and stay safe and cool. And we'll see you next time.
Okay.
Thanks very much.
Bye.
Bye-bye.